pretty great to be here. Out of all the places I could be this morning, I get to be. This is switch. Oh, switch. Yeah, the switch. All right. All right. Good morning. It's pretty great to be here. Out of all of the places I could be this morning, I'm here in a room full of people who really care about things, who really care enough to come out on a cold Sunday morning and reflect deeply, and who care about life and who care about the Dharma and care about each other. So I feel very fortunate this morning. Thank you so much for coming and listening. So as it happens, I'm going to be speaking 2 Sundays in a row. So I thought, well, I'll do a 2-part talk. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do a 2-part talk, why not talk about something I really love to talk about? So I'm going to talk about Sangha. I'm going to tell the story, which I really love, about how the Buddha built the first Sangha in the very beginning. So we call our community a Sangha. That was a word chosen by the Buddha for his community of followers. In Sanskrit, it means community. Literally, it means that which is struck together well. So it is meant to convey that it is something solid. And this is the MZMC Sangha, or part of it anyway. We have a lot more members who are not here this morning. But in the larger sense, the Sangha is all Buddhists throughout the world, going back to the Buddha's time. So I've told this story before about the early days of the Sangha, and this time I'd like to tell it. I'd like to tell a Theravadan story through a Mahayana lens. And if you don't know what those words mean, because maybe you're kind of new to this, that's okay. I'll explain briefly. Theravada is a name we give to the original teachings of the Buddha, the way he taught them. There was an emphasis on arhats and personal enlightenment. And folks later on maybe criticized that a little bit, saying that it was a little too focused on the personal, not so outward looking. And of course, Theravadan Buddhists are wonderful, kind people and really are outward looking and very active in their communities. But some say this idea of reaching out to others and of social action sort of being part of the fabric of Buddhism is something that was emphasized later on in Mahayana Buddhism, which developed a few hundred years after the time of the Buddha. So Mahayana Buddhism has the bodhisattva ideal, the ideal of a being who exists to help other people. And we have the paramita of dana, of giving. And Zen is a part of Mahayana Buddhism. But what I'd like to talk about this morning, what I'd like to touch on, is how that spirit of reaching out, of not being self-absorbed in terms of awakening, has really been there all along. So I'm going to touch a little bit on action in the world, including social and political action and community action. Not so much dealing on specifics, but on the deeper level of getting motivated and finding our inner strength, because I think that's something that we need now. So we have these radical changes going on in how our country is governed. And I think everyone, regardless of their political persuasion, is a little, or maybe a lot, uncertain about what's going to happen. And for a while, it seemed like people were just really putting all of this out of their mind. And I think that's changing. One person said to me a couple days ago, given the events of the past few weeks, it's hard to think about anything else at all. And some folks have a sense of kind of being overwhelmed, and some have a feeling that I have to constantly check the news or I'm going to miss something. And I don't think that's very helpful. I think if you do that, it just keeps you on the edge all the time. And what works for me and what I've been sharing with people is we do need to be informed about what's going on. We need to be well informed because, of course, we're going to need to respond. But dwelling on sort of the latest thing constantly can really just kind of get us really keyed up. And what I do is I try to keep it a little bit at arm's length. I mean, to some extent, I carry it with me all the time. I'm aware of it all the time. It's there, 5%, yep, that's going on. And sometimes I kind of go deeply into it. I go into my sort of deepest feelings about it because I need to do that. But I can't stay there all the time, I need to function in my daily life. And so it's important that I kind of regulate how much I'm going into this difficult stuff so that I can maintain my personal strength. And sometimes it seems like, I was talking to someone yesterday who mentioned this, it seems like people aren't talking to each other too much about all of this, and I don't know if that's a good thing. We may have the urge just to draw inward right now, but I don't think that's the best thing, because I think right now building community is one of the most important things that we can do. So I think this talk fits because it's about building community, how the Buddha built his community, beginning with the decision as to whether to have a community at all. So perhaps if we look at his struggle, and yes, the Buddha did struggle, we can look at our own struggle. Should we reach out at all, or should we just stay inside? Should we just be solitary? So, just relax, I'm going to tell this story. So we begin with the Buddha's enlightenment. You've probably heard, if you know much about the origin story, that the Buddha was raised in privilege and shielded from the troubles of the world, and then left the palace one day and saw 4 sights which awakened him to the suffering of the world. He became very troubled. He left the palace. For years he practiced austerities with 5 companions in particular. He left his 5 companions and he found the middle way. He found that starving yourself and engaging in austerities was not necessary. You could take food, it was okay. And then he became enlightened under the Bodhi tree, and that's quite a tale, but that's where we're starting today. So here he is, he's enlightened, he has transcended the limits of the personal self. He has connected with all beings throughout time and space. What will he do now? Well, when I started planning this talk, I thought I would go right into how he started building his Sangha with the first person he encountered and how that didn't go so well, because I really love that story, maybe because I'm devoted to Sangha building myself. And by the way, I'm really excited about our new member tea today at 11:30 in this room. It's one of my favorite things. But then I began to study various sources, and I was reminded of something that came between his enlightenment and his early teaching, and that was his decision as to whether to teach at all. And I find it really fascinating. I've heard that. Well, he decided, I probably can't teach because people won't understand it. But there's a lot more to it, and I've been reading up on it, and it's pretty much taken over all of the first talk. We may not even get to where he talks to that first person. That's okay, we can do that next week. So according to the Aryapariyasana Sutra, immediately after his enlightenment, he was hesitant to teach. As we know, he ultimately did decide to teach, and for that we are very grateful. We wouldn't be here if that hadn't happened. But I've always asked myself, how could this be? How could there be any doubt on the Buddha's part as to whether he would teach. Because the story is, he left the palace in order to find a solution to the suffering of all beings. And I think we've just taken it for granted that sharing the Dharma is the essence of the Dharma. And there are a few explanations offered in the literature for his hesitation, and I'd like to explore them. But first, I want to tell the story. There's quite a story as to how he was convinced to teach. And a lot of it involves gods and magic. And I think that's great, but if you're uncomfortable with gods and magic, I think that's okay, because we can probably accept both the gods and the magic as symbolizing struggles that go on within ourselves. So I've been looking at this book, Gautama Buddha by Hajime Nakamura, and he examined the oldest texts and he found the following story, and he compared two of the very oldest sources, and this language is common to both of those sources, so we know it's very, very old. So I'm just going to read you a little bit from this. So this is after the Buddha's enlightenment. At that time, the Venerable Master was meditating alone, and there arose in his mind the thought, I have penetrated this truth, which is profound, difficult to perceive, difficult to understand, peaceful, sublime, beyond reasonings, subtle, intelligible only to the wise. Then there arose in the mind of the Venerable Master wonderful verses never heard before. That enlightenment which I have attained through many hardships, should I now teach to others? Those who hold fast to greed and hatred cannot easily understand this truth. Against the common stream, subtle, profound, fine, and difficult to perceive, it cannot be seen by those who are lost in desire, cloaked in darkness. And so his heart was inclined to do nothing, and he had no thought of teaching the Dharma. So what happened? Well, just then Brahma, the Lord of the world, becoming aware of the thoughts of the Venerable Master, thought, alas, the world will perish. Alas, the world will be destroyed. For in the heart of him who has perfected his practice, of the one worthy of veneration, of the truly enlightened one, there is an inclination to do nothing, and there is no thought of teaching the Dharma. And so then Brahma, Lord of the world, came down to the earth, came in front of the Buddha, bowed down to him and said, Venerable One, let the Venerable Master teach the Dharma. Let the Blessed One teach the Dharma. There are in this world those who from birth have few defilements. If they do not hear the Dharma, they will fall into adverse realms. If they hear it, they will attain realization of the truth. Having thus spoken, Brahma, the Lord of the world, said, in the past, an impure teaching appeared in Magadha, taught by defiled people. Throw open the gateway to deathlessness, I implore you, and let them hear the Dharma realized by him who is freed from impurity. And the Buddha then experienced a turning point in his ideas away from spiritual peace on a personal level toward the action of liberating other living beings. So, pretty dramatic. Brahma comes down from the heavens and convinces the Buddha to teach. And there's actually a longer version of the story, also put together by Nakamura from these old texts, in which the decision to teach evolved over time. So, for the first 7 days, the Buddha remained under the Bodhi tree enjoying the bliss of enlightenment. Then 7 days he spent in meditation under an Ajapala tree, and a person came by, described as a haughty Brahmin. So this would be the first actual human, I think, that the Buddha spoke to after his enlightenment. And this haughty Brahmin was unimpressed with the Buddha because the Buddha was not of the same social class. So the very first encounter with a human was not a success, and perhaps the Buddha found that discouraging. Then he sat for 7 days in deep meditation under a Mukalinda tree. And there he sat cross-legged, experiencing the joys of liberation. Before long, a great storm arose out of season, and for 7 days it rained without cease, and a cold wind blew. At that time, Mukalinda, the Naga king, which is basically a very large snake, like a hooded cobra, emerged from his abode and wrapped himself 7 times around the body of the Blessed One, and extended his great hood over the Blessed One's head, thinking, "May cold not touch the Blessed One. May heat not touch the Blessed One. May horseflies, mosquitoes, wind, heat, and reptiles not touch the Blessed One." And then he released the Buddha from his coils, and the Buddha recited the following verse of uplift. The one who has realized, such as me, his solitude is happy, he who is content, who has heard the teachings, who has seen the truth. Happy is freedom from malice toward others and self-restraint toward all living beings. Happy it is to be rid of all greed toward the world and to transcend all desires. The greatest happiness is control of the pride that comes of the thought, I am. So here he experiences great love and protection from a God, and when he's released from the coils, he emphasizes the joys of personal enlightenment, not the joys of sharing yet. And then the next 7 days, he sits under a Rajayatana tree, where he further enjoys the bliss of enlightenment. And now these 2 merchants come along. They are named Tapusa and Balika, and they bring him offerings of barley cakes and honey dumplings, and they say, "We take refuge in you and your teachings." So as far as I know, these were the Buddha's very first 2 human followers and his first 2 lay followers. And the story is that they were sent by a deity in order to help convince the Buddha to teach. But Nakamura says this can also be considered an historical event. So maybe we're kind of moving beyond the realm of the gods here into the realm of things that might have or did really happen. And we know that these 2 people, they were merchants, just kind of regular people, were capable of seeing the Buddha's enlightenment and capable of following that same path. And the Buddha sees this too. Then the Buddha returned to the Ajapala tree, which is where the intervention from Brahma took place. And the Buddha relented and he said, "I will teach." So what are we to make of all of this? How could it be that the Buddha, after his enlightenment, would initially decide not to teach? It would appear that he was wrong about some things after his enlightenment, because as it turned out, teaching was the right thing to do. We all know this. And I think the best way to look at this legend is that it really humanizes the Buddha. It presents him as someone who, even after enlightenment, is still developing his understanding. So this is something we can relate to. The Buddha is human, like us. And that's good news. It means we can be Buddha ourselves. It means the Buddha is not out of reach. And of course, we already are Buddha. We just don't always believe that. So it seems like in these old stories, there's always a sort of a magical, perfect explanation that we read about. And then there's this story kind of behind it that we can surmise that's a little more realistic and a little more believable. Like in koan, some little thing happens and someone becomes instantly enlightened. What the koan doesn't tell you is that the person has been practicing hard for 25 years before that happened and working up to it. And we have the magical story of Brahma convincing the Buddha in about 5 minutes to teach, and that's the most well-known story, but we have that more obscure story of this unfolding over several weeks. And we'll see this again next week when the Buddha goes back to his 5 companions and begins to teach them. The common story is that one of them became enlightened instantly, but there's another story that says, well, it took weeks and weeks of teaching for this to happen. But I find it actually very helpful and encouraging to think that the Buddha struggled because, number one, it says that teachers aren't perfect, and I happen to know that that's true. And I know that if we expect our teachers to be perfect, it's going to cause problems for everyone. And also, it just makes the Buddha more relatable. So there are these reasons that have been given for the Buddha's hesitancy to teach. The first is that he simply wanted to enjoy the bliss, and that's what he did at first. And I think we can believe that. Maybe he was so blissful for a while that other people didn't even enter into his mind. And it seems kind of radical to say this, and maybe even a little bit disrespectful, since the story is that he left the palace with the express intention to save all beings. But if it's a humanized Buddha, we can understand that total, complete bliss would be attractive, and that you might think, well, maybe I'll just stay here forever. Maybe I don't ever need anything else. And there's even something in the literature that suggests that after his enlightenment, he still had attachments, that he didn't want to leave his seat of bliss under the Bodhi tree, and for him to leave it, divine intervention was again required. And there is a story about how he wouldn't depart from the Bodhi tree, and these devas appeared. These devas are kind of like our goddesses, and they came in and they said, there is something more that Siddhartha, seated there like that, has to do this day. He has still not abandoned his attachment to the diamond seat. So, full disclosure, I'm bending the story a little bit to make my point because the Buddha actually said to them, no, I'm not attached. But I do believe that an enlightened person can still have attachments. They never lose their early conditioning. They never completely transcend their early karma. They work with their attachments in a new way, but the attachments do not disappear. So the second reason for not wanting to teach is found in a book called The Buddhist Tradition, which says that from the standpoint of ordinary logic, his freedom from all attachments should mean that he feels no obligation or responsibility to help others. Insofar as they would not be seen to have any true selfhood or individuality, their sufferings would be as transient and illusory as they themselves. So, the self is illusory, our individuality is illusory, we're not even real, so why teach? Why teach people who aren't even real? And this taps into one of the most common questions I hear, which is, well, if we're not really real, if all of this is an illusion, why do anything? Why bother? Why even care? And the answer to that is a little beyond the scope of this talk, but it's good to see that maybe the humanized Buddha struggled with this too. I mean, I think we know in our heart that it matters, that we should care about all of this, even if the self is an illusion, because our connection to everything is not illusory. The third reason that's given is that people would not understand. And as you heard, the Buddha himself said that in the quote I read. And Fumio Masutani suggested that his hesitation came from the solitude of the truly enlightened. The Buddha alone understood it and didn't know how to share it, he said. Karen Armstrong, in her book Buddha, said his knowledge was ineffable and could not be described in words. He believed that people would not be willing to undergo the yogic and moral disciplines required. And then fourth, he doubted his own ability. The Buddha doubted his ability to teach. And Nakamura says, based on the old texts, the enlightened Gautama was uneasy, lonely, and confused. This is an important point. Even an enlightened person can be confused. In other words, enlightenment can exist within confusion or delusion. And this really challenges us, I think, that an enlightened person can be confused. But it fits the Mahayana idea that you're Buddha already, you're perfect in your imperfection, and that everything is Buddha, even your delusion is Buddha. And we can't help but dwell anywhere else but in our delusion, because we're all deluded. And the final reason for his hesitation to teach is my favorite reason, because it fits my worldview, and that is that he did not realize at first, or maybe he forgot it for a moment, that sharing the Dharma is absolutely essential to practicing the Dharma. You can't have one without the other. And I love the idea that helping others is so very central to Buddhism that you can't really be a Buddhist without doing it. Karen Armstrong says, an essential part of the truth that he had realized under the Bodhi tree was that to live morally was to live for others. And Nakamura said that the dialogue between the Buddha and Brahma suggests Gautama realized that his enlightenment would not be perfected unless he taught it. In other words, an enlightenment isolated from people, abstract and floating in limbo, is meaningless. So, becoming enlightened, simply enjoying bliss forever, it's meaningless because you're not coming back to society. So we can see that in the Buddha's choice to teach, that serving others was there all along, although it may have been more emphasized in Mahayana teachings. And so you could say this was the monumental turning point in Buddhism, the Buddha's decision to teach. Without that decision, we would not have had Buddhism. We would have had the Buddha, but he would have kept the Dharma to himself, and there would have been no Sangha. So let's not be alone. It is unnatural to be alone. And I think there are a lot of parallels between what the humanized Buddha went through and what we're going through today. His question is, should I share the Dharma with people? Our question is, how do we relate to an interconnected world during difficult times? How do we share our own personal Dharma with others? How do we avoid that complete isolation? The Buddha was distracted by personal bliss. That can happen to us. We can cut ourselves off from everything. We can meditate all day. We can enjoy personal bliss. We can achieve that kind of an attachment to our own personal diamond seat. And don't get me wrong, personal bliss is wonderful and we should all enjoy it, but it does not lead to happiness to confine ourselves to our own personal bliss. And it's not best for all beings if we think it's the end of the story. We return to the marketplace after we tame the ox. We can get distracted by the idea that there is no self anyway, so none of it matters. That's a fallacy, of course. It matters. We are all connected. The Buddha initially thought that people couldn't understand. I think a parallel for us is that sometimes we think that, well, if we try to talk to people, they won't understand us or we can't possibly be effective. There's nothing we can do, said 200 million people. There's a sense among some folks that we're quite helpless. There's not much we can do. Things might play out in the courts. We don't know what to do ourselves, but we can still be effective on so many levels, from building community to political activism, to giving money, to keeping ourselves strong and encouraging strength in others. We may not know exactly what to do now, but we can prepare for the time when we do know. We can make ourselves strong. And then finally, there was that inability to see that sharing the Dharma is inseparable from practicing the Dharma. Well, we can strive to practice with others, to be active in our Sangha, and to be active in our community. And probably the gods are not going to come down and help us with that. Probably Brahma's not going to come down and wake us up at 5 a.m. so we can come here for meditation, Monday through Thursday morning, by the way. But actually, the gods can help us. If we see the gods as a symbol of sort of what's going on within us, right? We all have these things pulling at us. We've got the gods in here. If we see that, we can see them as helping us to bring strength and discipline to our inner lives. The better part of ourselves says to be strong and to be active. So in that sense, the gods will come if you invite them. How do you invite them? Well, I think first, stop letting in so much noise, because you can't hear them with all that noise. And second, meditate and be deliberate. Gather yourself. Gather yourself up. Gather yourself up in order to lose yourself, and in losing yourself, you find your connection with all beings and you find your true self. And in yourself, you can find all of the strength of the universe. And you can do this. And that is my talk for today. Thank you so much for listening. You've been very attentive. I appreciate it. Even through the long quotes and everything. And now I'd love to hear from some of you if anyone would like to say something, including folks online. I can't see you today, but I'm sure there's a way that you can. Actually, I'm not sure. Can folks online ask questions today? No. Oh. They speak through the. Okay. Okay. Anyway, sorry for that confusion. We're kind of changing in our ever-present attempts to improve the tech. We try new things. Yeah, so would anyone like to say something? Katie.
So can you talk a little bit about sort of the difference between sharing the Dharma and teaching the Dharma and sort of evangelism?
Yeah. Sharing and teaching the Dharma, I kind of use those words interchangeably, but there is a difference there. I mean, teaching the Dharma is really for folks who are sort of authorized to teach, you know, who have, and that authorization is important, I think, because it helps people to understand who they can rely on, who's had proper training, etc. Sharing the Dharma is something we all do. And it can be kind of an informal teaching. It can be talking to people about the Dharma. And we certainly can share the Dharma just in the manner in which we conduct ourselves. You know, we may not mention the Dharma. Someone may never know we're a Buddhist or anything about that. But in our manner, we can kind of, convey that. And it can make a profound difference for someone. And evangelism, yeah, that implies we're sort of going to people and saying, hey, you ought to be a Buddhist. And that's what we don't do, right? We like invite people, like here we are, this is Zen Center, you may come here and we will teach you if you would like. But we don't go door to door and say, hey, you should be a Buddhist, because, well, we have a lot of respect for people. We know there are a lot of different religions because there are a lot of different kinds of people. And we don't say, you know, we've got the right answer. We say, we've got the right answer for us. This is working for us, and you're welcome to come check it out. And if you want it, we would love to share it with you, but we're not going to evangelize. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Thank you.
Could I comment on that?
Certainly.
I really like that distinction between sharing and then I have this very vivid memory of I was with somebody in the public at one time who was also an MZMC member, and I was talking to somebody And at the end, we wrapped up and the person who was familiar with it said, nice proselytizing. And I was like, oh, okay. So maybe like finding that fine line between like you said, evangelizing, proselytizing, and, yeah, just being genuine.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And it occurs to me just now that when I say sharing the Dharma, I'm not always talking about sort of letting other people know about the Dharma. I'm kind of talking about going forth into the world and manifesting the Dharma in a helpful way. And I think that's a pretty important point to make. Thank you, Dom. Yes.
What I think of is like kind of like true self versus like the lower or elevated self.
Mm-hmm.
And so not necessarily sharing in that, oh, I'm gonna I know all these things that other people don't, so I need to inform them, kind of thinking it more as just kind of letting your true self shine through in the community or in the world, instead of just kind of hiding that or living in the lower self.
Yes. Yes. Well said. Thank you. And Holly. Yes.
I just kind of wanted to offer up a reflection. I really appreciated the talk today and thinking about creating community.
Mm-hmm.
I am an executive director of a local nonprofit organization, and I think for this sector, the past couple of weeks have felt like a real existential threat to organizations that are doing really good work to serve our communities. It's been really tough. And one thing I would like to maybe invite in this room is if people have areas that you care a lot about, we've been talking a lot about how it's great to just choose 2 or 3 to pay attention to or watch the news on, to not get overwhelmed, so that you have the space to then take action and
Mm-hmm.
trust that there's someone else who cares about something else, and that they're gonna pay attention to 2 or 3 things and take action on it. So I wanted to sort of invite, if folks are interested, I've been in the nonprofit sector for a while, if there's practical ways or ideas that you want to get involved. We, as a sector, we really need help right now from people. And there's a lot of really easy, small ways to do that that will make a really big difference. So, yeah, I'll be around after.
Okay.
I'll try not to proselytize too.
Okay. Thank you, Holly. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. All right.
Do you think that when you said that the Buddha still has attachments because we still have these deep conditionings, do you think that the attachments can just be there because as long as you're in a human form, the human animal has to kind of have some attachments, and then we have this, the higher self or whatever that is relating to that, and the Buddha is very much in the higher self, but he still has the human form, so he still has the sort of those ingrained things. That, do you think as long as we're a human, there's going to be that, there's going to be sort of an impulse or a drive towards certain attachments, and then we relate to it and then kind of work with it?
I think so. We all have our early conditioning. We have our habit energy, to use Thich Nhat Hanh's term. And so, early on, I think things happen to us, and that will kind of form our responses. And we may have sort of default or automatic responses to things. And I think even an awakened person is going to retain that kind of thing. But an awakened person is going to be able to see that, be very aware of it, and kind of adjust for it. Like, oh, that's happening. I can see that right now I sort of want to be driven by this default position, but it does not have to be that way. And we're all kind of working on awareness of that kind of thing. Yeah, and I like the idea of, not sort of thinking of teachers as sort of, godlike and perfect, but thinking of teachers as people who are very advanced in their ability to work with their individual conditioning. Thank you. And John.
Yeah, I'd just kind of like to reiterate, it's been brought up a couple times here. The concept that basically every action, every moment that we're alive, we're teaching. I mean, I think about birds as a really great analogy. Birds have to teach their young how to be in the world in a very, very short amount of time. And we don't know, perhaps they're talking to them, but all that research is, I mean, it's just through action that young birds are watching their parents at all times. And I think that's kind of a good analogy of every moment that we're interacting with another person. In essence, we're teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, every little action matters. Yeah, thank you, John. Anyone else? If not, why don't we stop there and we'll turn it back over to John for some announcements.
okay. First I'm going to pass